The air in the Tower of London was thick with fear on May 19, 1536, as Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, knelt on a scaffold that had been specifically erected for her execution. She was about to make history as the first English queen ever to be executed. But here's a shocking truth that often gets overlooked in history class. Her execution wasn't just about disposing of an inconvenient wife. It was a chilling lesson in psychological warfare, one that would haunt her daughter Elizabeth for the next 6 decades and forever alter the course of English history. Over the next few minutes, you'll discover the gruesome story that unfolded over the next 17 days, a nightmare that went far beyond the sharp blade of a French executioner's sword. These details, gathered from eyewitness accounts and even letters from the Tower's constable, were so disturbing that they were suppressed for centuries. I hope everyone helps me with a like and a subscription, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. Imagine this on May 2nd, 1536. Anne Boleyn, seated in the royal box at Greenwich Palace, is watching a jousting tournament as Queen of England. She drops her handkerchief, a traditional gesture of favour to a knight below. Henry VIII, upon witnessing this innocent act, storms out of the event. Less than 24 hours later, Anne is arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and high treason. But here's where it gets even darker. Henry had already signed her death warrant before any investigation even took place. The destruction of Anne Boleyn was carefully orchestrated, starting with charges so extreme that even her fiercest enemies doubted their truth. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, crafted a case that accused Anne of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother George. Just imagine that an accusation of incest to ensure her execution. The evidence. A court musician named Mark Smeaton, who after being tortured on the rack for 24 excruciating hours confessed to the charges. The other 4 men, including Anne's brother, denied the accusations even as they were sentenced to death. But here's where the deception deepens. The prosecution fabricated timelines to make their case appear solid. They claimed Anne committed adultery on specific dates when historical records show she was in completely different locations. On May 13th, 1535, for example, they claimed she was at Greenwich Palace committing adultery, but official documents confirm she was actually 10 miles away at Richmond Palace. They didn't even bother making the lies plausible, because they knew it wouldn't matter. The verdict had been decided long before the trial began. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuys, a man who loathed Anne, even wrote to Emperor Charles V admitting that the charges were based on presumption and certain indications with no solid evidence or confessions. When even your enemy acknowledges you're being framed, you know something's terribly wrong. But the most chilling aspect of this whole ordeal is that Henry VIII wasn't acting out of uncontrolled rage. His actions were calculated and deliberate. On April 24th, just 8 days before Anne's arrest, Henry signed a commission granting Cromwell unlimited power to investigate and prosecute anyone at court. Cromwell later boasted that he had been tasked with ending the mistress's trial, not with finding the truth, but with closing the case quickly. If this is a side of Tudor England you've never heard before, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because I'm revealing the untold story behind the palace walls in my ongoing series on Tudor conspiracies. Now let me take you to the twisted psychological torment that Anne endured the moment she arrived at the Tower. Instead of being locked away in some dark dungeon, they did something far crueler. They placed her in the very luxurious apartments where she had once prepared to become queen, just 3 short years earlier. Picture that, the same tapestries, the same furniture, the same views. Where she had once dreamt of her future as queen, now she was forced to face her death. Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, documented Anne's every movement in letters that have survived to this day. When Anne arrived at the Tower, she asked Master Kingston, "Shall I go into a dungeon?" To which he replied, "No, madam, you shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." As Sir William Kingston documented, she fell into a great laughing, as she's done many times since. But that laughter wasn't joy, it was the sound of a woman's mind beginning to fracture under the crushing weight of impossible stress. The psychological warfare against Anne intensified as the days dragged on. Every word she spoke was recorded. 4 ladies in waiting were assigned to her, but they weren't there to offer comfort. They were spies, including Lady Kingston, the constable's own wife. These women reported everything: Anne's dreams, her prayers, her desperate attempts to understand what was happening to her. Anne began pacing her rooms, alternating between uncontrollable sobbing and fits of hysterical laughter. At one point, she told Kingston, "I hear say that I should be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more, but nay, without I should open my body." She was willing to offer herself up to physical examination, hoping it would prove her innocence, a chilling sign of just how far she'd descended into desperation. But the cruelest form of torture was the manipulation of hope. They kept delaying her execution, forcing her to prepare for death multiple times. Originally scheduled for May 18th, the execution was postponed until the next day without explanation. Anne spent the entire night of May 17th praying, preparing her soul, and saying her goodbyes only for the sun to rise, and nothing happened. Kingston noted that by this point Anne seemed very desirous to be executed. They had broken her completely, so much so that death seemed like a merciful escape. Throughout those 17 days, Anne repeatedly asked about her brother George, and her father, unable to grasp the horrifying truth that George was also in the tower, awaiting his own execution, while her father Thomas Boleyn had completely abandoned her in a bid to save himself. No family members defended her, no friends spoke out. She was utterly alone, surrounded by enemies and spies waiting for death. The trial itself, held on May 15th, was a theatrical charade. But here's the shocking part on the morning of Anne's trial. Before it even began, Henry VIII told Jane Seymour that Anne would be condemned that day. While his wife stood trial for her life, Henry was already planning his marriage to Jane. The jury was stacked against Anne. It was carefully rigged with her enemies. 27 peers sat in judgment, including her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the proceedings. Yes, her uncle, her own flesh and blood, was the one to pronounce her death sentence. The jury also included Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk, who had openly mocked Anne for her appearance, calling her goggle-eyed. Another juror, Henry Percy, was Anne's former lover, whom she had been forced to abandon years earlier. There were even relatives of Jane Seymour, the woman who would replace Anne as queen just 11 days after her execution. It was clear from the start that the verdict was decided before she even entered the courtroom. Anne was denied legal counsel. She wasn't told the specific charges until she stood before the court, and she had no opportunity to call witnesses in her defense. The prosecution presented no physical evidence, and no live witnesses were called. The entire case relied on written depositions and hearsay. Yet when her uncle asked for the verdict, all 27 peers declared her guilty, every single one. The method of execution was another psychological blow. Burning was traditionally the punishment for a queen convicted of adultery and treason. But Henry VIII, in what he framed as an act of mercy, commuted the sentence to beheading. However, there was a catch. He insisted on bringing in a special executioner from France, an expert swordsman from Calais. This meant more delays and more psychological torture as Anne waited for her specially imported executioner to arrive. Why a French swordsman? On the surface, it seemed like a merciful gesture. Death by sword was quicker and cleaner than by axe. But I believe Henry had a deeper motive. By using a French executioner, he sent a powerful message. Even her execution had to be handled by foreign hands. It was so far outside the bounds of English law, so utterly beyond redemption, that it required a foreign executioner. This was a final humiliation, a way to mark Anne as other and outsider, not truly English, despite being the Queen. On the morning of May 19th, Anne's transformation was complete. Witnesses described her as almost ethereal, dressed in a grey damask gown with her hair tucked under a simple cap. The woman who had once radiated energy and commanded attention was now pale, composed, and almost translucent. She had transcended fear and entered a strange state of acceptance that unnerved everyone who saw her. On the scaffold, Anne gave a speech that has been debated by historians ever since. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord, and asked the crowd to pray for him. Some interpret this as Stockholm Syndrome. Others believe she was desperately trying to protect her daughter Elizabeth. Her exact words were, "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentleman or a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with that French sword. But then came the moment that haunts me. Anne turned to her ladies and said, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." She placed her hands around her throat and laughed. That wasn't gallows humour. That was a woman so thoroughly broken by the psychological torment she had endured that she was joking about her own beheading. The crowd fell completely silent. The French executioner was indeed skilled. Anne knelt upright in the French style, not bent over the block, and kept looking around waiting for the blow. The executioner had hidden his sword under the straw, and as Anne awaited her fate, her life, her tragic, twisted life, came to its horrific, inevitable end. Distracted by his assistant, the executioner struck with a clean cut. Witnesses later claimed that Anne's lips continued moving in prayer for several minutes after her head had been severed. Whether this was a sign of remaining consciousness, or simply muscle contractions, we'll never know for sure. But that image of her lips still moving after death burned itself into the minds of everyone present. And here's where the cruelty takes on a whole new level. They hadn't even prepared a proper coffin. Anne's sobbing ladies-in-waiting had to wrap her head and body in white cloth, placing them in an old arrow chest they found in the Tower Armoury. The first Queen of England to be executed was buried in a box meant for weapons, unceremoniously dumped in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No funeral, no prayers, no marker. It was as if she had never existed, but the horror didn't end with Anne's death. Let me tell you how this affected her daughter Elizabeth. Just 2 years old when her mother was executed, Elizabeth was only 8 when she watched her stepmother Catherine Howard meet the same grim fate on the same scaffold. It was then that Elizabeth declared, "I will never marry." She kept that vow for the rest of her life. The Virgin Queen's refusal to marry, a hallmark of her reign, was born from the shadow of that scaffold. Elizabeth could never publicly acknowledge her mother, Anne, had been branded a traitor and adulteress. Yet in private she wore a ring, her entire adult life, a ring with hidden portraits of herself and Anne Boleyn positioned face to face. When the ring was finally removed after Elizabeth's death, courtiers discovered the secret she had carried for decades. She also kept her mother's Book of Hours, her jewellery, and even displayed Anne's falcon badge in her palaces when she thought no one was watching. But what truly exposes the psychological damage is Elizabeth's complicated relationship with executions. Unlike her father, who executed on a whim, and her sister Mary, who burned hundreds, Elizabeth agonised over every death warrant. When Parliament demanded the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth delayed for months. After finally signing the death warrant, she claimed her advisers had tricked her. Some historians call it political theatre, but I see a woman haunted by her mother's ghost, terrified of becoming the monster her father had been. The execution of Anne Boleyn did more than just rid Henry of an inconvenient queen. It shattered the very foundation of English justice. It showed the world that the law meant nothing if the king was displeased. Evidence could be fabricated, juries could be packed, and even the sacred bond of marriage blessed by God could be destroyed on royal whim. If the Queen herself could be subjected to judicial murder, what hope did anyone else have that precedent claimed its next victim just 6 years later? Catherine Howard, Anne's young cousin, was executed on the same Tower Green on charges just as fabricated. By then, the machinery of royal destruction that had killed Anne had become a well-oiled system. People knew the script: arrest, imprisonment in the Tower, a packed jury, a predetermined verdict, execution. The only variable was the method. Catherine Howard got the axe instead of the sword. But here's the truly harrowing part that I haven't shared yet. Remember Mark Smeaton, the musician whose tortured confession set this entire nightmare in motion? He was the only one of the accused men who confessed, and the only one from a common background. The 4 gentlemen, including Anne's brother George, maintained their innocence, to the end dying with noble dignity. But Mark Smeaton, he vanished into historical silence after his confession. He was executed without ceremony, his family destroyed, and his name forever tainted by lies extracted through torture. The events of those 17 days in May 1536 revealed the true horror of Tudor power. Not just the public executions, which were meant to terrorise the populace, those were theatre. Everyone understood that. The real horror was the systematic perversion of justice, the psychological destruction of the victim, and the participation of family members in the judicial murder of one of their own. Anne's uncle pronounced her death sentence. Her father didn't lift a finger to save her. The entire English establishment collaborated in the killing of a woman they knew was innocent. International reaction was swift and damning. The French were so appalled by Anne's execution that Lancelot de Carle's secretary to their ambassador wrote a 318-line poem about it within 2 weeks. Henry, deeply disturbed by the spread of this account across Europe, ordered his ambassador in Paris to suppress it. Even in an age of brutal politics, Europe was shocked that a king would execute his queen on such obviously fabricated charges. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis, who despised Anne, wrote to Emperor Charles V, noting that people were openly murmuring about the trial and execution. That's diplomatic speak, for everyone knows this was murder. Foreign courts were outraged, and the world knew it was wrong. The execution of Anne Boleyn not only shattered England's sense of justice, but also marked a turning point in Europe's perception of Henry VIII. Kings and rulers across the continent began to reconsider their dealings with a monarch who could so easily dispose of his wife. The speed of Anne's execution, just 17 days from accusation to death, wasn't simply a matter of efficiency. It was a calculated move to prevent any attempt at defense, any second thoughts, or any intervention from those who might have tried to help her. The swiftness ensured that no one would have time to step forward to raise doubts or to challenge the king's will. Modern historians have thoroughly proven Anne's innocence. The dates didn't match, the accusers were tortured or coerced, the jury was packed with her enemies, and the evidence was fabricated. Even at the time, few believed the charges, but that wasn't the point. The point was to send a message Henry VIII's will was absolute. Marriage meant nothing. Even queens who had been crowned anointed with holy oil and placed on a pedestal by the state and the church could be torn down and destroyed if they became inconvenient. Anne Boleyn's execution stands as one of history's most chilling examples of judicial murder. Yet in a twisted way, Anne's death also set the stage for the rise of England's greatest monarch, Elizabeth I. The trauma of her mother's execution shaped Elizabeth into the ruler who would define a 45-year reign, defeat the Spanish Armada, and transform England into a major global power. The Virgin Queen, who refused to marry and ruled with calculated brilliance, was forged in the horrors of May 19, 1536. Would Elizabeth have become the extraordinary ruler she was without that childhood trauma? Would she have developed the steel spine to survive in a world dominated by male power, without the example of her mother's destruction? We can't know for certain, but what we do know is this. Anne's death and the injustice surrounding it created the very thing Henry VIII feared most, a daughter who would surpass him in every way. She would rule longer, more successfully, and be remembered far more fondly than the king who had killed her mother. The Tower of London still stands as a haunting reminder of that dark time. Tourists now stroll through the same rooms where Anne spent her final days and take pictures on Tower Green where the scaffold once stood. There's even a glass memorial listing the names of all those who died on that spot, but no tourist attraction can truly capture the horror of what happened. There, the systematic destruction of a human being, the perversion of justice, and the active collaboration of an entire system in judicial murder. Anne's death could have happened to anyone. It happens whenever power decides that the law no longer matters, when evidence is fabricated, when juries are packed, and when the verdict is decided before the trial even begins. That is the real horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, not just that an innocent woman died, but that an entire nation stood by and watched it happen without intervening. Every time we accept injustice because it doesn't directly affect us, every time we remain silent while power corrupts justice, we participate in the same horror that killed Anne Boleyn. Her ghost doesn't haunt the Tower of London. It haunts every courtroom where the verdict is decided before the evidence is presented, every system where power outweighs truth. The French executioner who carried out Anne's death was paid £23 for his work, about £8,000 in today's money. That was the cost to kill a Queen of England. But the real price was paid by English justice, by every person who lived in fear of royal power, and by a small girl named Elizabeth who grew up knowing her mother's tragic fate. That price is something England is still paying. If this hidden history of Tudor horror fascinated you, make sure to check out the next video, in which I reveal the dark truth about Henry VIII's medical condition that may have driven him to murder. Discover how a jousting accident transformed England's golden prince into history's most notorious wife killer. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.